It is amazing to see how the song of history continues to rhyme. A few days ago, the Chancellor of Germany, Olaf Scholz, had a meeting in Tokyo with the Prime Minister of Japan, Fumio Kishida. And together they talked about deepening ties between Germany and Japan, not only economically, but militarily. And this is obviously against China and Russia. Not too long after this meeting took place, the head of state of China, Xi Jinping, made a trip to Moscow where he affirmed Chinese-Russian relations. There is an obvious antagonism between the Russian-Chinese alliance and the German-Japanese alliance. And this is historical. This has roots in history. This is not very complicated. Russia and Japan had two wars, one of which we all have heard of. We all have heard of the war in the Pacific. The Russians and the Japanese were at war during World War II. But there was also a war before that called the Russo-Japanese War, which took place from 1904 to 1905. And the Russians lost that war to the surprise of the world. And there is still territorial disputes between Russia and Japan. There is a territorial dispute over the Sakhalin, or the Sakhalin, and there is also a territorial dispute over the Kuril Islands. China and Japan also had two wars against each other, although they were much more bloody than what happened between Russia and Japan. There was, of course, the war between the Chinese and the Japanese during the Second World War, which was extremely brutal, and that is an understatement. Imperial Japan butchered millions of Chinese civilians, raped hundreds of thousands of women. They had so-called comfort centers, and basically these were centers where Chinese women were forced to be sex slaves, and they were called comfort women. And they were raped repeatedly, and many of them were murdered. And many Japanese government officials will deny that these atrocities even happened, just like the Turkish government today denies the Armenian genocide. But there was also a war between China and Japan that took place before that. There was the First Sino-Japanese War, which took place from 1894 to 1895. So there is a history of war between these two countries. And there's also a history of alliances. The Nazis and Imperial Japan were allies against China and Russia. And the Russians and the Chinese have historically been allies. So this is historical. This is all rooted in history. It's all rooted in history. And you can see the song of history rhyming. There have been some very, very interesting developments that have occurred within recent years. For one, just a number of years ago, the Germans and the Japanese formed a free trade agreement. And it is an enormous free trade zone, the one that is between Germany and Japan. The two countries have been deepening ties economically, very much so. And now they are talking about deepening ties militarily. The Bundeswehr, it has been announced, and it was announced in this meeting between the Japanese and the Germans, that the Bundeswehr will be making a trip to Japan next year. So you're already seeing ties being deepened, ties being made, not only economically, because everyone wants to talk about the economics of it, because that's just less scary. But not a lot of people are talking about the military ties, the defense ties that are being made between the two countries. And this is very, very significant because you have to ask yourself, why are they forming military ties? Why? Because they are preparing for war. When you see countries boosting up their defense budgets, their military spending, this is a sign of a coming conflict. Germany, since the end of the Second World War, has been dependent on the United States for its security. But this is changing. This is altering. And every year we are seeing Germany becoming more and more independent. You are seeing Germany speak more and more intensely about becoming more militarily independent from the United States. We saw a more intense incremental step towards this last year with the Russian war with Ukraine. Olaf Scholz, not too long after Russia went to war with Ukraine, declared that Germany must be the most powerful country militarily in Europe because Germany must be the protector of Europe. And the Germans and the Japanese, they have both been increasing their defense spending. And it was reported today that next month, Japan's defense budget is going to be the biggest it has ever been since the end of the Second World War. And they're saying similar things about Germany's defense budget. The Germans are planning on having the largest military force in the European Union. People will argue, how can Germany have a huge military force? It doesn't have enough young people. I've heard this argument numerous times. For one, there are literally millions of young men in Germany. If Germany had a draft, it could easily force millions of young men to join the military. Millions of young men could be forced into joining the German armed forces. So there's that. And also, Germany is the head of the European Union. There are over 500 million people living in the European Union. And the Germans have been talking about military integration with the other European militaries for years, integrating the militaries of other European countries into the German armed forces. So you have see, this is what I don't understand about this argument. People say, Germany can't have this big army because, there's not enough young people, blah, blah, blah. Okay, other than the fact that there are literally millions of young men living in Germany who could be drafted into the German armed forces. You also have the fact that there are literally over 500 million people living in the EU, okay? It's a much larger population than that of the United States, which means that if the Germans could get the individual militaries of other European countries to be integrated with the Bundeswehr, then you can have millions of more young men fighting for Germany. This is very possible. The Germans have been talking for a long time about bringing in the Balkan countries into the European Union. So, and also that would mean integrating the militaries of the Balkan countries, integrating Croatian soldiers, integrating Bosnian soldiers, integrating Albanian soldiers, integrating Kosovar soldiers into the Bundeswehr, and it'll be the Third Reich all over again. It's not that hard to imagine any of this sort of thing happening. It's not that hard to imagine this happening. So you have Germany planning on being the mightiest military force in Europe. You have Japan increasing its military spending. You have Japan wanting to become a very powerful military force. And now you see Germany and Japan talking about deepening their ties militarily. What are we seeing, everyone? What we are seeing is history repeating itself, or at least the song of history rhyming. You see the Russians and the Chinese deepening their alliance. You see the Japanese and the Germans deepening their alliance. You're seeing the United States wanting to become more and more isolationist. So what's going to happen when America says, okay, we don't want to be the world's police force any longer. Germany, Japan, you guys take the reign. Japan, you become the big military might in Asia. Germany, you become the protector of Europe. What's going to happen? Germany and Japan are going to have an even bigger alliance. They're going to have a very, very robust alliance or military pact. And you'll have Germany being the biggest military might in Europe, leading Europe both economically and militarily. And you're going to be seeing Japan really, really flexing its muscles and going against the Chinese. This is what the future holds. It's really quite obvious. I expect that there will be a war between Japan and China in the future. And I also expect that there's going to be a war in Europe again. And this is why the Germans have been talking so much about increasing their military spending and strengthening their military. And also talking about integrating the individual European militaries with the Bundeswehr. What we are seeing, everyone, is a preparation for the next World War. Anyway, you guys just heard some theology. God bless.